Fidget spinners, adult colouring books, weighted blankets. We're seeing the rise of what's called anxiety consumerism. What does it mean when there are millions of products now just to calm us down? Welcome to the programme. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Do you remember that fidget spinner craze of just a couple of years ago? At the time, it seemed, didn't it, a little bit like the latest toy fad, the yo-yo, Rubik's Cube type of thing. But now it's being linked to a much bigger trend, the growth in anxiety and its treatment and the economy that is surrounding all of that. Weighted blankets, meditation apps, adult colouring books and fidget spinners are marketed as ways to relax and combat anxiety. There is little scientific proof that these work, but goods and ideas costing billions of dollars have been snapped up, selling a clear message. We are more anxious than ever, and we're trying to buy our way out of the problem. According to the UK's National Health Service, 1 in 4 adults and 1 in 10 children experiences mental illness. Anxiety as a disorder is estimated to affect up to 5% of the UK population. In the United States, it's become the most common form of mental illness. Public spending on mental health is being increased in England over the next 5 years. But services are under greater pressure as more patients are diagnosed. So will we see more innovations capitalising on an anxiety epidemic in the years to come? Well, we head first to the United States, to Atlanta. Kathleen Hall is joining us from there, Chief Exec of the Stress Institute and founder of the Mindful Living Network. With me at the round table, Mark McDermott, Professor of Health Psychology at the University of East London. Denise McKenna, too. She's an activist at the Mental Health Resistance Network. And we are also joined by Dr. Carolyne Keenan, a chartered psychologist. I'm going to go round each one of you and ask you, first of all, do you think anxiety, Mark, you first, anxiety disorders are increasing, or are we just talking about it more?
No, there has been some evidence that suggests that there has been an increase in recent times in anxiety disorders, and not only this century but last century too. The rates of mental health disorders have increased, but it's difficult to disaggregate what that's about. Is that about a real term increase, or is it about less reticence on the part of people to report these things? I mean, if we went back 100 years ago, we didn't even have a lexicon, a vocabulary to talk about some of the things that we take for granted today. I mean, the word stress wasn't in the vocabulary.
Yeah, or PTSD was shell shock in the First World War.
Exactly. So as soon as you bring some of these things into being through language, they become more talked about.
So we may be more aware of it simply, or there may be more of it. But if there is more of it, Denise, and you've suffered from mental health problems yourself.
Yes.
Have you any idea why?
Oh, yeah, a whole range of things. Early childhood trauma, classism. I experienced dreadful classism, and homophobia, which I experienced as a young girl. All of these things have caused me problems. And, of course, poverty. I was brought up in poverty.
But let me just say, as Mark suggested, these things were around 150 years ago. Why are we feeling more anxious about them now?
Well, because, first of all, we're feeling more anxious about it because we're living in we have the word precarity. No one knows where the next wage is coming from. I mean, not no one, but a lot of people don't know what they're going to be earning from week to week. There's a tremendous sense of insecurity in the workplace. There's also this blaming culture. A word that we hear a lot from America, from Donald Trump, is the word loser. So we have a society where we're thinking of people in terms of winners and losers rather than as communities. So we've lost community. We don't have the same communities we had. So these things...
So the stresses you think are greater than they used to be. We have to learn to find a way to deal with them. Carolyne, I'll come to you in just a moment. But Kathleen, Dr. Kathleen, Denise was mentioning the United States here and Donald Trump, and I'm not going to put you in that category, of course. But you do sell some of these techniques, some of these some of these ideas that some people have suggested are mere snake oil. They don't really exist except in the minds of people like you who sell them to vulnerable people. Is that fair?
I think you also have to add an age that we're in, which we're seeing a lot more of it globally, is technology. So where we used to maybe have a war in Africa or a fire or a disease breakout of measles in China, now within a few minutes, it's globalized and people get stressed. They immediately think, oh my God, it's going to happen to me. It's a pandemic. It'll be here in 5 minutes. And also, I don't think that we can underestimate with technology, the incredible shadow side of technology is the loneliness and the isolation we're seeing. And especially in the UK, you all have done amazing seminal research on the impacts of loneliness on healthcare and the impacts of loneliness on mental health. So, we can't leave out the driver. Also, things like climate change. I just left Ted Turner in the group here. Al Gore was just here, and we were all talking about climate change. And if you could have taken the blood pressure, heart rates, and the basic metabolisms of people when they went into this meeting, and 3 hours later, it was unbelievable how terrified, out of control. So I think that we feel out of control in these global elements.
Okay, so you think you have an answer to this, or at least a partial answer. Is that fair?
Oh, I have an answer to the...
Well, to some of it. I mean, you set up the mindful technique.
Oh, the Mindful Living Network.
Stress techniques.
Right. I truly believe the reason that I shifted from the Stress Institute to the Mindful Living Network, I think until we all realize that we are one people, one planet, one future, I think popularism and nationalism and this great radical individualism, that we're the spawners of it, of course, let's make America great again and make Brexit great again and make Poland great again. And I'm not blaming any specific thing, but it's a disease that's spreading just like the measles.
Okay, but let's get into the plethora of treatments that there happen to be. I mean, you talk about mindfulness, but what about, we'll open this up to you in the studio as well. What do you think about things like the finger spinners, which I mentioned at the beginning? What do you think about things such as a heavy blanket, weighted blankets that sort of pin you down and keep you still at night, if you like? What do you make of all of this? Are we seeing a bunch of crooks out there, or are these real therapies?
I think a lot of them are evidence-based and have good outcomes, but they're short-term and they're not getting the seed of the problem. They're not at the taproot of the problem. And the taproot of the problem is that people really feel out of control and they're pretty much living lives of quiet desperation or meaningless. That's how they feel. So the more you can put 20 blankets on you and put spinners on every one of your fingers, but it's still not going to cure the underlying problem of anxiety that is infiltrating the world at this point.
And that's the truth, Caroline, isn't it? I mean, and until you make people feel worthwhile about themselves and the world perhaps in which they live, you're going to need more treatments because there are going to be more problems.
Well, and are treatments the answer? Probably not. So it depends on what we're talking about, because I think there's a wider issue here when we're talking about this rise in anxiety. But I think in terms of what has been shown anecdotally to make people feel better, I actually don't think there is a huge amount of evidence to suggest that fidget spinners and things like that do work in the way that they are sometimes marketed to do. There is anecdotal evidence that people find them soothing in the same way that weighted blankets people can find soothing, they like them. But
for every person who finds a nice weighted blanket a good way to go to sleep, there's going to be somebody who feels claustrophobic because they can't budge.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a one fit for all. And I think that's where marketing falls down, that sometimes they make these sort of sweeping claims that this is the answer. And actually, when it comes down to human experience, people are individual, and what is going to work for one person isn't necessarily going to work for somebody else.
It's really difficult then to call out the charlatans, isn't it? To see who's actually sort of, as I mentioned, selling snake oil and who is actually doing some good.
Well, is it snake oil, or is it something that might work for some people? I guess that's the question. So some people might genuinely benefit, and for them, they might feel better. But I think we are talking about a sliding scale in terms of, or a sort of spectrum in terms of how people experience what we're calling anxiety. What is debilitating for somebody and referred to as anxiety might be something that is stopping somebody thriving in the way that they're used to, but referred to anxiety for somebody else. So I think we need to be clear about what it is that we're talking about, what are the experiences that people are having, and are we pathologizing what is a normal human experience, or are we not treating what is actually becoming a debilitating situation for somebody.
Kathleen, I will come back to you because I saw you nodding there. I will come back to you in just a moment, but let me bring that back to the studio. This is part of the issue, isn't it? Is that it's not one thing. Anxiety is not one thing. It describes a multitude of problems.
But the causes of mental ill health are not one thing either. They're not simply about a lack of perceived control. They're not simply about helplessness and hopelessness. You have to ask, where does a lack of perceived control and hopelessness come from? And I think there's a lack of understanding, and I don't see why we can't teach this in schools, about the kinds of phenomena that across generations and across cultures have always perturbed and distressed personkind. You know, we know about this stuff. The research has been around for 60 years. The work on stressful life events that are so-called that. You know, the things we find most stressful are usually things that involve loss of some sort of kind. You know, the death of the spouse year after year has been found to be the most stressful life event we can experience. That 8 out of the top 10 most stressful life events all involve loss of some kind or other.
And do these alternative treatments, sorry to cut you short, but do these alternative treatments help in situations like that? Or are they only at the lower end of the scale, rather than at the extreme
some
trauma?
Some of them are really just ameliorating symptoms. They're not really teaching people how to deal with loss. They're not teaching them how to make use of their relationship networks to ameliorate the effects of stressors. I mean, you know, one of the recurrent findings is that a major stressful life event, in the absence of good social support, in the absence of a close confiding relationship, a shoulder to cry on, is much more likely to make you depressed than the similar life event that you experience with somebody who can help you and talk to you about it. Denise, I mean, it's a fundamental, you know, to me, understanding of mental health, and it's just not out there enough.
Okay, and why we haven't got to that point of understanding is something I'd like you to address later.
Yeah,
sure. You wanted to come in.
There is an additional thing that's emerged recently, is the idea of inequality. And we do know that not just mental health, but physical health is much worse in countries where there's a huge gap between the rich and the poor. I think Wilkinson and Pickett have written about that. They've recently produced a book called The Inner Level. So we do know that makes an enormous difference. And I'm going back to that word loser, because we are now in a society which is judging people according to what they've achieved and what they've got. And an awful lot, and I don't agree with Catherine that we're all one world. We know that there's 1% of super rich people. We know that there are people living on the streets. And there are it's not about people feeling that they're not in control, or that a lot of people, they simply have no control of their lives.
And let's take a look, Denise, at your book, which it's from the Mental Health Resistance Network. It's a list of demands, among other things, and it says, we consider short-term CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, and mindfulness, Kathleen will come back to you on this, to have limited value. Explain what you think, and then we'll go to Atlanta.
Yeah, well, what I think, first of all, one of the things that we are wanting to bring into the whole idea of mental distress is the fact that a lot of problems, they're not just social, make it bigger than that, they are political. So we're living in a very extreme society, we call it commonly called neoliberalism. And there are very extremes of rich and poor. CBT can help with sorting out short-term problems.
And the same you think with mindfulness?
With mindfulness, yes, but what they don't do is that what they do, rather, is that they depoliticize people. They're locating the problem within the individual instead of looking out to the wider world.
Well, that's something presumably you have to deal with, Kathleen, isn't it? You know, identify where the person feels the persecution or the problem's coming from.
Well, I think that we have to take a deeper dive into all of this. That we teach our children in kindergarten and first and second and third grade how to read, how to write, to prepare themselves for the world. We teach them to put on a coat when it's cold outside. But the thing about mindfulness or mindful living is, if we could teach children how to become more aware in K through third grade, we actually show studies that they become more aware of when they're aggressive and when they're hateful, when their heart rate races faster, when the people make them anxious. So I think the fundamental thing is that we have to look to larger institutions to begin to plant the seeds of each of us becoming more aware of when our anxiety, when our depression begins.
If I may interrupt, you're talking
go ahead.
about prevention. Here we're talking about treatment once that situation has arisen. And Denise's point is, if I may summarize, is that CBT and mindfulness mask the real issue. So how do you deal with that? The real issues being that these people are out of control of their lives, their problems are coming from elsewhere.
I really believe, since it's so global and so huge now, we have to look at it on a larger scale, whether it's our educational systems, our corporations like Microsoft, or global concerns and in the government, that we're going to have to figure out how to systemically handle this, since it's, the cat's out of the bag, so to speak. And again, terrorism is not going away. We just had another synagogue shooting here in America this weekend. We've normalized this violence and terrorism. That's another thing. Along with technology and isolation, it is a different era that we're living in this era of terrorism and the media taking off with it. We are at a constant state of hypervigilance, which we know what that does to mental health.
Okay, Carolyne, you don't have to sit there looking at the monitor. She's there larger than life, and you might get a better idea of what's coming from Atlanta if you do that. But let me ask you, Carolyne, with everything you've heard at the moment, do you think there are any hard and fast rules when it comes to self-care? I think they call it nowadays, don't they?
I think what we need to be doing is empowering people towards finding out what works for them. And I think we're talking about perhaps different situations. So if somebody has come to me who is struggling in a work environment and is aware that it is the work environment that is causing anxiety, and there maybe is a lack of awareness about what self-care might be for them, there's been a lack of space for that perhaps in the working environment that they've been in, part of my job might be to help them establish where they might fit that in. How might I adjust my lifestyle in order to make sure that there is space for me, that I am thinking about what I need? I think that's very different to when somebody might come to me and they have had a history of poverty, abuse, traumas, losses, and we're talking about something slightly different there, I think. A fidget spinner, a weighted blanket, self-care, having a bath, those sorts of things might alleviate some suffering.
All of these
Colouring
things.
books, all of those things.
It's designed to return people to a certain equilibrium, isn't it?
Well, and for some people it might help, but it is not going to take away the experiences that somebody has had. And I think this idea that it's going to be this big plaster over it all is probably misleading for people.
But I wonder if, in fact, these things can do more harm than good.
If it does, though, I mean, but the implication that mindfulness is a sort of panacea for all ills, I think is misleading, and I'm sure probably that wouldn't be contended, but that seems to be the impression that's given sometimes about mindfulness, that it can deal with everything. I mean, our government recently proposed that we roll out mindfulness for school kids in group situations. Now, for some children, that might help.
With children, let me interrupt here.
Yeah.
With children, would that mean just teaching children how to be nice and considerate to one another?
Well, it could be. Well, it could be. Mindfulness is about being in the present moment.
In a group situation.
And about being in contact and how you feel right now. But I mean, for children that have experienced significant trauma, let's say, in their early life, to have them concentrate on their here and now feelings can release feelings, focusing on trauma, traumatic memories, that really, let's say, a teacher in a classroom is not really going to be able to contain in a clinically meaningful way. So I would say, actually, rolling out mindfulness as a group intervention amongst classrooms of kids is contraindicated for particularly for kids that have experienced trauma. And this is a thesis that has been expounded in relation to prisoners in a book called The Buddha Pill recently.
Yeah.
I mean, I trained as a clinical psychologist. The first thing we were taught to do was you spend the first hour and a half listening to your clients and hearing about the uniqueness of their backgrounds and history.
Well, let's bring Kathleen in, because you heard her say she disagreed with you.
Yeah.
Tell us why.
Now, because if you're talking about a stone cold clinical mindfulness program like we have here at Emory where we do research, yeah, that's right. I've actually been trained in developmental mindfulness in schools, K through 3, developmentally and psychologically, 3rd grade to 5th grade, 5th grade to 7th grade, 7th to 9th, and 9th to 12th. And what I do is I work in the most violent schools in Atlanta. And I also work in the school in Atlanta that is 99% Latin, which is a very high risk here because they're taking their parents away and sending them back to South America. I work with very at-risk groups. I go in there, I don't have them get quiet and all their hate come up or whatever. We talk about awareness and we talk about compassion. Our grades have gone up. We have less violence in the schools. So any incremental, any marginal changes that we can make in this behavior in these school systems is huge. And so it's not a clinical mindfulness program like John Kabat-Zinn has up at UMass. These are generative growing programs that are helping children. For an example, if the child next to you is biting their fingernails or you smell urine and they're wetting their pants, instead of making fun of that child, what mindful living and mindfulness does is makes you aware, and you might say, are you okay? I noticed your fingers are bleeding. They might tell the teacher. But people like myself that are trained go into these classrooms. It's not on the teacher's back.
Is there a danger that what you consider to be your very best practices, which you think help people, and you have evidence, you say that happens, that these are being tarred with the same brush as those practices that are being put out there simply for people's profit, which are likely to do no good if you analyze them, or perhaps act as some kind of panacea? That this whole idea of self-care, which is what mindfulness is to some extent, they're all being lumped together and getting a bad name, unfortunately.
I agree. That's why we didn't call it the Mindfulness Network. We called it the Mindful Living Network, because we wanted a place where if you wanted to begin to raise a mindful family, mindful eating, mindful technology, if you wanted to learn to live a more mindful life, you could come in and share ideas and get professional, educated, and experiential education on how to live mindfully.
In terms of where we go now, is there any way that we can look at this the multitude of different things out there for self-care now and think actually we have come some distance, if not as far as we might like? Carolyne, you first.
There are options, I guess. There are not enough options, and if we're honest, it's probably not good enough in terms of being able to manage it. But I think that's where we come down to, the world that we're living in at the moment is not good enough in terms of wiping out all of these things. But what I would say is that there are quite normal things that we're talking about here. It is normal to become anxious. It is normal to feel stress. It is normal to feel upset about things. And I think where we maybe need to be focusing some attention is on resilience and helping people to have faith in their resilience. Human beings have huge capacity to survive very, very difficult experiences, which I think is important. But can it all be packaged up in a self-care parcel with a nice bow on it and sold to people? No.
You see, this is where we've got to wrap the programme up in just a moment. I wonder if it's possible, perhaps, to have some kind of medical test or clinical test to see whether these things are the snake oil that some people suggest they are, or whether they're really helpful. I mean, to go through a National Institute of Clinical Excellence type of thing.
Yeah, nice programme. But I mean, the problem, of course, is that the rate at which these apps are being produced and that we just cannot keep up with evaluating them properly. I mean, we all know in this room that the gold standard way of evaluating an intervention is through a randomised controlled trial, an RCT. But very few of these products have been put through an RCT. It's expensive, it's time intensive, but it is the best way to do it. And so, if I'm a health user out there, I'm going to go online and look for that kind of evidence if I want to be convinced of
think that's what
a
people
program.
should do?
I think that's one thing they can do, but then you have to really begin to educate the public not only about the causes of mental health, but you also have to educate them about how to evaluate evidence. And that's a whole nother ball game. But I think it's an important one.
And it's also very difficult to do that when you're in a state of mental illness or
for sure,
or
for
anxiety.
For sure.
Surely this all comes down to whether, in fact, we as a society care. There is more awareness now of mental illness, but it's also about whether the people in charge care enough. And you don't think our authorities do care?
No, it's not even the authorities. I think that one of my big concerns about all of this stuff is that the one thing we never talk about is critical thinking. We're not teaching children to engage in critical thinking, to understand why there are power imbalances, why they are being violent, why have they got guns in America? All of this stuff, this is critical thinking. We need to teach children these things. Care is not a thing you feel, it's a thing you do. Love is a thing you do. Do you make the world a better place? Yes, when I see someone in the street homeless, I don't see how mindfulness is going to help them. I see that a home is going to help them.
But it's love of oneself as much as anything.
Oh, I see what you mean, yes. Love of oneself. Yes, but love of oneself, again, is about critical thinking, understanding why one is in the situation that one is in, and not to blame oneself, and all of everything that's happening in psychology and psychiatry at the moment is saying the problem is within you. What are you going to do to make things better, instead of what can we as a society do?
Not just a society, but all those people out there marketing these new
yes,
these heavy mattresses, these whizzy spinners or whatever they're called.
Music any day.
Okay, that's it. Tune into a good radio station or get the best stuff you can on your iPad or iPod, or if it exists anymore. Listen, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Kathleen, in the United States. Thank you to my guests here in the studio. If you have learnt anything from this, then it's been a worthwhile programme, but at least we are talking about it more and more these days than we used to. From me, David Foster, from the Roundtable team, thank you for watching. Goodbye.